just check the sound levels here to see if these are comfortable for you. And I'd like to begin just by appreciating the solid and subtle foundation that Emmy has laid for work that I would also like to pursue in a somewhat different vein of registry. So, heartily thank for the lace. It's a wonderful lesson that you've given us about the importance of an existential foundation for our work. Whatever our preferred theory, whatever our context of practice or research, I think it provides a kind of ample grounding that I also want to borrow as I look at the specific relevance of some similar themes in the lives of clients, research participants who bring forward stories of great despair, perhaps much like your client that we'll need to learn from in your writing rather than in your speaking. And here I'd like to begin with a thematic introduction to this. Maybe we could regard it as a sort of footnote, an elaborated footnote to Emmy's presentation, focusing on mourning and meaning, the narrative arc of tragic loss. And by that, I'm using the idea of a kind of narrative structure, a kind of story structure, for accommodating the way in which our life stories are challenged and often changed by profound experiences of suffering, specifically in the context of bereavement. But I want to speak in a way that is inclusive of, or at least suggestive, of the impact of other losses in the course of living. Here I draw on an image by an Italian constructivist friend of mine and John Raskin's, Carmen del Cavarsano. And Carmen is from Sicily, Sicilia, in Italy. In her native culture, there's a concept of il monachicchio. And a monachicchio is a child who has died before it is christened, and whose spirit, in some sense, continues to haunt the home and family that gave it birth. Today I want to draw on this image of a monachicchio, one who we see, in some sense, staring out from between the lines of what we might take to be this family's life story, that goes up in a kind of conflagration of pain in the wake of that loss. I want to draw on this image to signal not only some of the pain, distress, and ultimately the efforts to rewrite a personal or family story in the wake of such loss, following the death of a child, but also to do so in terms of several other problematic experiences of bereavement. I'd like to share with you some glimpses from my work with some of my clients to suggest some practices that might be coherent with this constructivist, meaning-oriented perspective to bereavement. And I especially would like to feature some images of what we're learning from our systematic research on meaning-making in the context of loss. And so that is our charge in the time between now and our coffee break. With a bit of a story from a client of mine whose real name is Gail. She prefers that I honor her story and her son's story by sharing with you something of the truth of their experience and not disguising it clinically. Gail and her 19-year-old son Max lived what can properly be regarded as a love story, but also a lost story. And that story, as it was told in the newspapers in our city of Memphis just 3 years ago, featured a mother and a very promising son, one of 3 such sons in her family. As she bid her son goodbye, he got into the Ford Explorer of his girlfriend, Tess, along with another friend of theirs, Adrian, to begin the long drive back to college, driving across the vast and sometimes empty expanses of the American West. Max sat in the back seat, and he was sending messages, texts, to his friends about the boredom of a long drive through Oklahoma, about his preferences in music. And 15 minutes after those texts were sent, somehow, for some reason, the automobile in which they were riding left the road, crashed, turned over 3 times, burst into flames. What ensued was a kind of rescue effort on the part of the highway patrol, on the part of the medical helicopters that came to transport these wounded young people to a medical center, a trauma center quite some distance away. The other two young people were belted into the car. They were able to escape once it rolled and before it burst into flames. Max had not been wearing seat belts, and as the car rolled, he was thrown from the vehicle and sustained very heavy injuries to his head and to his body. It was in this context then that Gail, in a board meeting of her organization, received a fateful phone call. And that phone call began with, "Gail, I have some bad news." And it proceeded to tell her about this life-changing event of the very grave injury sustained by her middle child, Max. She gathered her wits about her as best she could, made a flurry of phone calls, received a flurry of additional ones from concerned friends and family, locally at a distance, and proceeded to fly then to the trauma center in which Max was being cared for. And it was in that very trauma center then that she saw his body virtually unrecognizable from his wounds, his head swollen to twice its normal size. It was in that hospital that she had to make a difficult decision in the light of the doctor's advice that, "Gail, this is a catastrophic injury. This is not a survivable event." And in the days that ensued over this long weekend, she had to make the hard decision to withdraw life support from this brain-dead child in order to allow his body to complete the process of dying. As she held him, as she screamed to his unresponsive body, "Please breathe, Max, breathe!" And of course, he could not answer that in the way that she needed. Now, that much of the story is told in the papers and in her initial elaboration of the experience in the context of our therapy. What I want to do is to follow that story more deeply in the context of that ongoing therapy, which spanned a period of approximately 2 years, in order to, in some way, frame, almost in a snapshot way, different aspects of the narrative part of traumatic loss, a loss shared, of course, not only with Gail and her family, but by very many who suffer tremendous adversity. And so, with this idea of a narrative arc, I want to begin with the notion of the shattering of our life stories. The way we are shaken, not merely stirred by traumatic or potentially traumatic events, to use George Bonanno's apt phrase. I want to follow us into the therapeutic or restorative retelling of those life stories in a way that can help people again begin to make some kind of sense of the plot structure of what they have suffered, to somehow struggle with how to fit this difficult chapter into a larger life narrative, and in the course of doing so, to seek that underpinning theme that can give coherence even in the midst of immense trauma and inconsistency. I want to follow people as they reconstruct their life stories, often in the context of therapy, but more often outside that context, in the discourse of their communities, the value systems that have long held them. And ultimately, as they move toward the integration and extension of that story into their own changed lives. And so, to begin this, I'll start with a few comments on the shattering of life stories, here drawing on an image by the Belgian surrealist artist Neimeyer in his image entitled Tombe de Nuit, or Nightfall, as he presents to us an image of a world once taken to be quite real, which upon impact with a shattering life event is revealed to be merely illusory. It lies in fragments at our feet. It is that set of sundered assumptions that Ronnie Jenner-Holman and others have given attention to, the way in which our basic assumptive world regarding the predictability of life, the trustworthiness of people, our capacity to protect those we love from harm, our own sense of worth and value. All of these these may be called into profound question in the context of life-shattering losses. One image of such losses emerges for us clearly in our work on homicide survivors. And so I'd like to present to you a bit of this research program, which is focused on the toll of violence in one community particularly beset by this in our violent country, the United States, as we're reminded tragically of the shootings in Aurora, Colorado, so recently, echoing, of course, more than dimly, the shootings in Eaton Center, right here in Toronto, just so recently. So I want to speak with you a bit about both the struggles and some of the resources that might be found in African Americans adjusting to the saturation in their communities and lives, their saturation in homicide loss, referring to a paper that was just published this past month in the journal Psychological Trauma. Here I want to introduce you to a client of mine who began as a participant in our research study and then requested additional services. Her name is Elise. She lost her son, Asa, in a circumstance of shooting in which she believes that Asa was lured into the home of his ex-girlfriend, confronted by her current lover, and then gunned down in his presence, in the presence of the girlfriend as well. Of the 7 shots that he received, 4 were in his back, the final one in the back of his head, as he attempted to run and escape the shooting. And so I want you to listen to just 2 minutes of what Elise has to tell us about this experience as we look at this conjunction of complicated, protracted grief on the one hand and psychological trauma on the other, as she recalls this experience for us.
Never shot multiple times and make it all I see is every waking hour, every waking moment I have. That's all I see is I've seen about 20 different scenarios. I call them flashes of Asa getting killed. He's doing this. Everything. I see this. And that is, and I'm telling you, I keep thinking, Jesus, I need a psychiatrist. You know, I can't even walk around without, go to the kitchen without seeing Asa die fine. Because, you know, the detective would tell me when he was hiding by the bed, and I'm like, I don't want to hear it anymore, but I kept listening to one. And he said, he lunged at the man. Asa was scared of a butterfly. I'll tell you that Asa was scared of a roach, and he wasn't about it. After trauma like this, you see your child.
You see your child dodging bullets and stuff. Although she wasn't there, the visual imagery is as pronounced as if she were a witness to the shooting.
You see your child there. It's a nightmare. It's a trauma you got to deal with. But I've always been second to you can't get rid of the trauma, the nightmare, the horror of it.
And so here in the words of one bereaved mother, we find someone at this existential brink of horror as she confronts not only the death of her child, but the violent circumstances under which this occurred. How long after Asa's death do you believe she was participating in this research interview? 4 years is the answer, giving you some sense of the persistence of trauma, at least for a subset of those who suffer. So our interest ultimately was in understanding the aftermath of homicide bereavement in this community. A community that, as statistics from the Centers for Disease Control of the United States inform us, occurs with 10 times the frequency among African Americans as among Caucasians like myself. So this is an urgent problem in a community like ours, a city that is substantially African American, and in which Caucasians like myself are in a definite minority. As you see here too, the city of Memphis has this tragic distinction of being one of the murder capitals of the United States, with a murder rate twice that of the national average, already quite elevated over civilized countries like Canada. And so let me bridge over then into talking a little bit about the study, recruitment of participants. We partnered with a faith-based support group, advocacy group, entitled Victims to Victory, that worked with all survivors of homicide, regardless of ethnicity or faith tradition or lack thereof. We focused on 54 participants, all of whom were African American, most of them women, many of them losing their children, but also their spouses, parents, and so on, to a variety of forms of homicidal violence. They were remarkably diverse in age, education, and socioeconomic status. Very many of them were middle class, many of them were college educated, and it was clear that trauma was not something that was relegated to those who were poor. All were within 5 years of the loss of their loved ones, and on average, they were less than 2 years out from that horrific event. Now, what I want to do is to focus on a couple of features of this work. First, I want to paint for you a kind of picture of the symptomatic struggle faced by very many of the people in this sample. Second, I want to focus on issues of meaning, particularly in the terms in which they are most relevant for this community, a community that is strongly Christian in its orientation, and for whom an attempt to draw on sources of religious strength and grounding are a primary way in which they attempt to cope with the horror and trauma of such homicidal loss. So here I'm going to focus on PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, as formally diagnosed in our study, complicated grief, understanding this as a protracted and anguished form of separation distress that keeps yearning and burning for months and potentially years after the loss, to a degree that is very life-vitiating, very disorganizing, very compromising of one's engagement in other valued relational and occupational contexts, and significant clinical levels of depression faced by this group. Looking at the sample then overall, what we learn is that in contrast to most bereaved people, if we look at a general cross-section of those who have lost loved ones, what we would find is that only 10% tend to show this kind of debilitating, life-fixating complication in their grief. 90% respond either adaptively, across time, finding again the balance they had lost, or, as George Bonanno has so eloquently demonstrated in many studies, resiliently, after transient distress, finding again their ground. This majority experience is denied the majority of those who have suffered homicide loss in our studies. Fully 56% of this population experienced complicated grief years after the loss of their loved one. So much so that this represents the highest single report of the incidence of complicated grief of which I'm aware in the published literature, closely followed by survivors of horrific trauma in Serbia in the late 90s. Second, we find that nearly as many experience clinically significant levels of depression, and nearly 20% would formally qualify for a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, with all of its features of hypervigilance, a kind of anxious awareness of insecurity in the world, a strong reliance on avoidance coping, and intrusive experiences of the traumatic experience itself, much as was evident in Elise's report of Elise's death. But importantly, even in the context of such horrific trauma as this, we found that 37% met criteria for precisely none of these conditions. Again, testifying to the reality of resilience, even in the face of horrific trauma. And we're particularly interested then in those factors that serve as protective buffers against the stresses of trauma for this subgroup, as well as the symptomatology suffered by many. Now, of course, if you do the math here, you find that it easily adds up to more than 100%. How is this the case? Because, of course, life doesn't present to us a single problem at a time. Oftentimes, we have two or more problems for the price of one in the wake of very severe trauma. And if we look then at how the Venn diagram of this existential condition plays out, what we find is that only 14% of people experience a relatively pure, complicated grief. Only half as many experience a pure form of depression. And instead, nearly a quarter stand at the intersection of those two conditions. They certainly have two problems for the price of one. And if we ask ourselves, where then are those who experience PTSD situated within this diagram? Can you guess? They stand precisely at the intersect of these other two conditions. Virtually everyone in the study who qualified for a PTSD diagnosis also would meet criteria for clinically significant depression or complicated grief. Why is this relevant? Well, for one thing, we find that different professions tend to specialize in different disorders. If you're in psychiatry, what are you likely to be drawn to treat? Depression. Why? Because the answer is pharmacological, or at least it's presumed to be. If you're a psychologist working in a Veterans Administration context, what are you going to be treating? Well, if you follow the evidence-based protocols that are offered you for prolonged exposure and cognitive processing therapy, you will focus on trauma. You'll focus on that aspect that has to do with the PTSD symptomatology. And if you're a bereavement counselor, as I also am, and in an organization like the Association for Deaf Education and Counseling, ADEC, what are you likely to be drawn to? Complicated grief. Why is it relevant to focus then on the intersect of these conditions? Because different forms of treatment are indicated for different forms of distress. And the psychopharmacology that might be at least marginally helpful with PTSD or with complicated depressive symptomatology has been demonstrated in randomized controlled trials to be of virtually no relevance to the core of separation distress and longing that is the heart of complicated grief, for example. Now, what I want to do is to shift from symptoms to significance and to look for a moment at the experience of not what we call complicated grief, as I just described, but rather what we are coming to call complicated spiritual grief. That is, to take a good hard look at spiritual struggle, crisis, breakdown, and ultimately the prospect of renewal in the context of bereavement. Drawing on an image here from William Blake's book of Job, Job, of course, in the Torah, being a figure who is allowed to be tested by Satan as God permits all that he loves, essentially, to be laid waste in a kind of test of faith. We find that many of those, with a Christian background at least, who hold a monotheistic trust in a kind of God who is personally available to them, have those assumptions severely tested and tried by the experience of profound loss. Of course, whether or not one will experience such perturbation at the level of one's core spiritual beliefs is very much a question of where we begin. What is our level of spiritual maturity to begin with? How solidly are we grounded in our faith community? And here I want to hasten to add that I am not an American evangelist here who will pass around an offering plate at the end of the service. I'm actually interested in this from one step outside this tradition. This represents one of several secular and spiritual systems that we're interested in investigating with reference to loss. So my remarks are not made from the standpoint of insider advocacy here. Spiritual grief, in the way we use it, is marked by temporary confusion, anger, attempts, sometimes despair, to discern God's will in this horrific event. And what we refer to as complicated spiritual grief involves a more persistent, corrosive engagement with this question, often marked by a kind of withdrawal or a sense of distance from God as well as from the spiritual community. And to give you a little bit of a sense of what this sounds like, I wanted to capture it to you, for you, in the words of some of our research participants. In all of our studies, we collect both narratives and numbers, looking qualitatively and quantitatively at the experiences under review. Here, in the words of this, let's say, 69-year-old grandmother grieving the death by shooting of an 18-year-old grandson. And she says, I felt that God had allowed the capriciousness of life to invade our world. I wondered aloud if our entire family, our belief system, were merely some form of cosmic joke. I questioned why God permitted such a painful and horrendous act when he had the power to stop it. Where was God when that trigger was pulled? Now this ultimately then reflects this struggle with God and what we have come to understand as a rupture in an attachment relationship to a non-physical kind of father figure. But we find that this vertical dimension of disruption is often paired with a horizontal level of disruption. That is, there's a disruption as well between the mourner's relationship with others in the faith community, others who share this same religious frame. In the words of this woman, she says, I thought I could rely on my church community, but they grew tired of trying to console me and took advantage of my vulnerability. They said they would be there for me, but I didn't realize that there'd be a time limit. This woman, at age 59, grieving her husband's murder as they were both out on a walk and were confronted by an armed robber. And so we find disruptions, again, on the horizontal plane of relationships with others, as well as on the vertical plane of one's disruption of belief systems of a more transcendent quality. To come to the chase and to share with you a few of the findings, what we did is we examined these same African-American homicide survivors. We assessed them across a 6-month period of time, longitudinal study. And what we did is we assessed their positive religious coping, drawing on Koenig and Pargament's scale to assess this. This is the degree to which they would seek consolation in their religion, scripture, in prayer. Negative religious coping, which is a kind of proxy variable for what we are now attempting to refine in its assessment, qualitatively and quantitatively, as complicated spiritual grief, as I've talked about, a kind of questioning God, questioning the connection with the faith community. We also assess depression, PTSD, complicated grief, as I've described to you. And what we attempted to do is to look at those factors at time 1 that predicted people's adaptation at time 2, some 6 months later. The short story of this histogram is that only complicated grief at time 1 was substantially predictive of people's level of negative religious coping at time 2. That is to say, it seemed to be this core disruption in one's relationship with the deceased. It is this experience of loss, of a loving attachment to this human figure that seems to call into question the viability or security of one's attachment to the divine. So, complicated grief became an instigating context for a festering kind of spiritual crisis that for some, approximately 25% of the participants, constellated into a kind of ongoing crisis of faith. Now, what I'd like to do is to turn to this idea of moving beyond the shattering of stories to the therapeutic retelling of them in a way that offers some possibility of restoration. Here I draw an image by an artist colleague and friend of mine, Lisa Jennings, the eternal circle, that suggests maybe the image of two figures who have traversed some rocky landscape together and now who move into a more level plane, perhaps seeking a kind of sacred circle that suggests a kind of return to wholeness. This is actually the cover of the book, Techniques of Grief Therapy, that was published with 80 of my closest friends as contributors just about 6 weeks ago. Here I want to just mention then the work of Kathy Shear, who has done wonderful randomized controlled studies, one of which is in progress now, one of which is completed and published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, on complicated grief therapy, a core feature of which is revisiting the story of the loss itself. Those of you who were in my workshop yesterday have a relatively strong immersion of this, as I demonstrated it in my work with Cara, a mother of a stillborn child, and as I gave more clinical context for the use of this practice. This practice, as well as many others, would be described in that Techniques of Grief Therapy book. There's some literature out there on it. So I'll need to curtail the elaboration of this, except to say that what we invite is a kind of slow motion retelling with strong immersion in visual imagery and strong attention to the emotional subtext of the story of loss, as the person shares a story that might previously have been held only silently, in the responsive presence of a witnessing therapist who can stand in the face of the horror alongside the person who experienced it. Retelling of this sort often tends to intensify distress in the initial retelling, and then in the subsequent processing of the experience and its subsequent exposure to the sometimes reported story of the event, tends to dampen and promote a kind of mastery of the experience. Kathy Shear's work in terms of her formal study drew on the experience of some nearly 100 persons, including substantial numbers of African Americans, contending with a complicated, prolonged kind of grief. And she recruited, as therapists in this study, those who have a strong adherence to and a strong familiarity with interpersonal therapy for depression, which has been demonstrated to be at least comparable in effectiveness to cognitive behavioral therapies in a huge NIMH study. What she did is she provided these therapists additional training in the special procedures of complicated grief therapy, which featured, though not exclusively, this revisiting protocol that I just mentioned, and alongside reconnecting with the imaginal image of the loved one in memory, and then a kind of imaginal dialogue, and revising life goals in light of the experience, as might be suggested as relevant by the dual process model of bereavement by Maggie Schroven and Henk Schut in the Netherlands at the University of Utrecht, as people then work to not only engage the experience of loss, but also to consolidate the experience of restoration in a changed life. What I want to do, though, is to underscore that many of us who work in the context of traumatic loss, including my colleague Ken Wright-Nearson, who works a good deal with homicide bereavement, and my friend and colleague Jack Jordan, who works a great deal with suicide bereavement, would all endorse this notion of restorative retelling, seeking ways to re-enter and reconstruct a traumatic story of loss along lines that are similar in many respects to that of Kevin Shears. So here what I would like to do is to return to Gail's experience briefly and to share with you a 2-minute snippet of her retelling. Now, Kathy Shear, when she makes use of retelling protocols, does so for 10 to 15 minutes of engaging the story of loss. At the point in therapy, when reviewing the story became urgent to Gail, and she requested time for just that, to, as she said, attend to not only her spiritual adaptation and the weight of loss, but also her heart as a bereaved mother. We took not 10 to 15 minutes, but a full 90-minute session to tell half of the experience of her son's injury and ultimately his death. And we then had, some 3 weeks later, after processing that first retelling, a second 90-minute retelling that carried forward from the point of his death to the point where she placed the first shovelful of dirt on his grave. And so when we're speaking of prolonged exposure here, we're talking about something more than simply a technical procedure practiced from the wrist down. This is something that goes to the heart of it for both the therapist and client. This is not easy to hear. I will mention it to you. Gail herself selected 2 minutes to share with you. And the minutes that she selected come in the near aftermath of her receiving this fateful phone call, as she begins then to be flooded by phone calls by concerned others. And she prepares to then fly to Max's side. 2 people are mentioned here to make the story intelligible. One is her older son, Morgan, or Morgie, who is a few years older than Max, and her younger son, Mike, or Mikey, who is a couple of years younger at the point of Max's death. And so here we want to listen to her initially desperate attempts to find some mastery in this narrative in the context of responsive therapeutic witnessing. Again, just a 2-minute snippet to anchor the idea.
Surprisingly, I answered them and said, please pray, and please pray, that's what I would say. And I don't want a dead network to go out. Please pray. I called Morgan.
And here the tears begin to flow. Her voice breaks. What comes to you?
Just so don't want to tell him that. Wanted to protect him. I didn't want to tell him. I had to. It's so hard.
Who was the hardest to tell? Who was the hardest to tell?
Because because Mikey is attached to his heart right now. He's depressed. And I didn't tell Mikey everything. He's 17. I told him that Max is really hurt. And, but I could tell that Mikey couldn't take it in. And I didn't tell him everything. But Morgan, he's 23 now, and he was 22 then,
She proceeds to then speak to the situation in which she is making this fateful phone call to her son, as he himself, in a distant state, drives back home from college. He says, Morgan, pull over to the side of the road. I need to tell you something about your brother. This is obviously a snippet of a much longer interview in which we would grade the various strands of significance, as we look not only at the external story of the loss itself, but also the internal story of how she responded at each critical turn of this event, and the reflexive narrative, the meaning-making that she engaged in, that evolved as the story did, and as her life has since that tragic chapter in that story. Here, drawing on the idea of different narrative voices by good researchers here, Lynn Angus, Heidi Levitt, and others at York University in Toronto. Now, I just want to quickly gesture toward the findings of some of the core findings of Kathy Shear's work. And the take-home message of this is, in this carefully randomized controlled trial of complicated grief therapy versus interpersonal therapy for people contending with complicated grief, what you find is whether you focus on the group who you intend to treat, whether or not they fully complete the treatment, or whether you look at those who complete the treatment as designed, all 16 sessions across 20 weeks, you have about twice as many people who respond in the complicated grief condition as in the interpersonal therapy condition. That is, who experience profound improvement as a result of this work. Giving encouragement, I think, to what we're finding in a variety of research contexts now, that various artful uses of narrative that often go to the heart of people's pain in order to seek the sources of resilience tend to assist them in moving forward with stories shattered by loss. And so I'd like to speak about the reconstruction of that story, here drawing on an image by the American artist J.D. Hilberry, who seems to be presenting an image of himself. It's a self-portrait, a portrait that has been, in some sense, just shredded by what we might imagine to be a very difficult life experience. And here we see him literally trying to tape back the pieces into some recognizable configuration to restore a coherent sense of perhaps his self-narrative in the aftermath of loss. If we look at Gail's experience in this context, what we find is that she drew importantly on spiritual resources that for her were anchored on the one hand in her strong engagement with the Christian tradition that had been very much part of her family experience, her family's Catholicism. And on the other hand, her deep and significant engagement in Hinduism and Buddhism, creating ultimately a kind of composite spirituality that helped her in some way hold this loss, at least provisionally, therapy making a distinctive contribution to that in her view. In some ways, this turned out to be very coherent with Max's own quest in the final 2 years of his life, as he entered a kind of spiritual quest of his own, one that found reflection even in his choice of music. Do any of you know the music of a youthful group called Cloud Cult? Cloud Cult? Well, if most of us here were much younger, you might have a chance of knowing this group. Very interesting group because they don't sing about love and rejection and the usual kinds of themes of pop music. They sing about kind of core existential themes. One of their albums is entitled Albums. I'm dating myself. One of their CDs is entitled Journey of the Featherless, in which they configure this idea of human sojourners, almost Icarus-like, rising above the surface of the earth and its materialist concerns in order to rise to higher purposes. One of the songs on that album turns out to be the last song that Max was listening to before he got in that car to return to college. And it was found by his young brother Mikey in his bedroom after his death. It's on an album, the same album, Journey of the Featherless. I'll just, with great apologies for my singing voice, I'll give you just a little bit of the lyrical content of that. I love my mother. I love my father. And when it's my time to go, I want you to know I love you all. Literally, the last song that punctuated his visit as he began that drive back. So these kind of apparently mystical conjunctions, these kind of synchronistic events, helped Gail herself and Tess, who had been driving that vehicle, Max's girlfriend, began to construct a kind of composite spiritual view in which they came to understand this tragedy and the suffering that it engendered as coming from a kind of soul contracting that they had made before this kind of incarnation, a kind of joint agreement to enter this life, confront this distress for the purpose of their own spiritual development, and to release Max from the cycle of birth and redeath as an old soul who had learned as much as he needed to in this incarnation. Now, in the broader context of our research on bereaved parents who engage in their own quests for meaning, I want to share with you just a few glimpses of what that research is telling us about their psycho-spiritual struggles and attempts to make sense of loss. Conducted this research with my colleague Nancy Kazee, Joe Currier. Nancy herself was a bereaved mother whose 2-year-old child died after long suffering of congenital abnormalities. And she and her family found herself looking for answers that could not be found in the medical records provided by physicians, as these parents, in a photograph by my photographer friend, Thomas Hochberg, who takes pictures of compelling scenarios of perinatal death as a kind of legacy gift to the parents. We see a father who seems to be staring skyward looking for answers that can't be found at the stillbirth of his daughter as the mother kisses that inert infant. We were very interested then in the role of meaning-making in helping parents accommodate this traumatic loss. We recruited nearly 160 parents from throughout the English-speaking world. Most of the children had died by accident or natural sudden deaths, as the heart failure that ultimately took the life of Nancy's own child. But we also see natural anticipated deaths represented as through childhood cancers that are progressive. And bearing in mind that these are the biological children, but not necessarily minors, we found significant incidents of suicide and homicide in addition to perinatal loss. So sometimes one might have a 50-year-old son whose suicide was being grieved by a 77-year-old mother, for example. Significantly and intentionally, we recruited a group that was quite diverse in their distance from the experience of loss in order to test the role of time in healing all wounds. What we did then is we considered the cause of death, whether it was natural or violent, the time since loss, and the presence of surviving children as possible objective predictors of grief, alongside meaning-making factors, suggested here in an image by Leonora Carrington, the Mexican artist. Agarita se fuga. Little Adele is flying, spleeting, is escaping a sick bed, perhaps of pain. Without hair, we might imagine that she was a cancer patient who now is released from that state as her abuela, her grandmother, her hijo, her little brother, look on smilingly, suggesting kind of a mystical meaning-making as she's surrounded by the same blue glow as characterizes the kind of totem of the iguana from her bed. So sense-making may be idiosyncratic, it may be culturally informed as people try to understand the experience of loss, or to find some benefit or life lessons in it, despite the real suffering it engenders, and as they attempt to reconstruct or rebuild an identity that has been challenged by loss in both progressive and regressive ways. To cut to the chase, what our findings tell us is that the ability to make sense of the loss accounts for 5 to 15 times as much of the variance or intensity in people's complicated grief symptoms. And here the 5% referred, or the 5 times greater impact is discerned using a scale of normative grief symptomatology, like crying, missing one's loved one, the core bereavement item scale of Beverly Raphael. The inventory of complicated grief, reflecting this more edgy, life-limiting accommodation of loss I described earlier, Polly-Crickerson scale, reflects an even stronger predictability for the sense of sense-making. By comparison, the cause of the death, whether violent or non-violent, and the time since the loss, whether measured in weeks, months, years, or even decades, account for trivial percentages of people's post-loss accommodation. What we find is that in general, sense-making is one of the most robust predictors of people's ability to encounter significance in trauma and accommodate it. In a subsequent study in which we're joined by Wendy Lichtenthal and Memorials of Kettering, we did intensive analyses of qualitative narratives, coding them, in order to look at what patterns of sense-making, what patterns of benefit finding were associated with lessened symptomatology, lessened complication and grieving. And we found that viewing the death as God's will, or endorsing the idea of an afterlife of return, tended to provide a good deal of support for people surmounting complicated grief symptomatologies. But so too did secular meanings, such as the sense that the child was no longer suffering, was free of pain. Benefit finding also encompassed spiritual changes and deepening, but also changes in secular and practical life priorities, lifestyle improvements, committing oneself to a life of purpose in the way that Emmy had eloquently described. Now, there are many narrative techniques, many of them written about sometimes in books that I've been involved in, but also in good work by others, that provide a whole panoply, a cornucopia of clinical methods that can be arguably drawn upon in the context of therapy in order to enhance reorganization of life narratives marked by loss. But here I'll gesture toward just one study, a representative study, also a randomized controlled trial of a narrative meaning-making intervention in the form of directed journaling by Wendy Lichtenthal and her colleague Diane Cruz, who recruited nearly 70 bereaved young adults who wrote intensively about their trauma in a kind of Jamie Pennebaker paradigm, either focusing on the emotional dimensions of the loss or specifically responding to an instructional set that invited them to consider the benefits found in that loss or the broader existential sense made of it, in comparison to a neutral condition where people simply wrote about the room in which they sat to control for the potential distraction of simply writing. What they found in a nutshell is this. Across the period of active writing of 1 week, all of the groups showed a temporary respite in their complicated grief symptomatology, as well as several other dimensions. But when they were followed across time, a full 3 months later, what they found is that for those in the active therapeutic writing conditions, the emotional disclosure, the sense-making, and most especially the benefit finding, these gains were not only maintained, but deepened across time, providing a kind of confirmation that carefully tailored interventions that make use of meaning-enhancing narrative work can be an important part of grief therapy. Now, there is much more that I would like to say and share with you as we speak about people's efforts to integrate the story of loss, to find a story that they can wrap their arms around, a story that they can hold, and a story that can hold them in the wake of their loss. I'd like to tell you about our work with the Integration of Stressful Life Experiences Scale, a valid instrument that we've carefully constructed, assessed for reliability and validity, the work of Jason Holland and one of my young colleagues and others, published in the International Journal of Stress Management. What we did is we found with this scale that we were able in 16 items to identify 2 subscales that assess the degree to which people felt securely rooted in the world, a kind of footing or grounding in the world, perhaps the kind of grounding that might follow that confrontation with the abyss that Emmy spoke about eloquently, capped by items like, this event made me feel less purposeful. We also identified another subscale that had to do with the ability to recognize meaningful patterns, comprehensible experiences, even in the wake of this event, or the struggle to do so. If this event is incomprehensible to me, would be one such item. We find, for example, that in the context of violent death losses, the challenge to comprehensibility is especially profound, as we use this scale with hundreds of people who have experienced losses of many kinds. And we find as well that whether we apply it to generally stressful life events or to bereavement specifically, a movement across time in our longitudinal research toward greater integration of the experience, greater meaning-making about the experience, is strongly predictive of a reduction in general distress for those who are experiencing generally stressful life events like relationship losses, career failure, and so on, and complicated grief reductions for those who are bereaved. Sometimes meaning-making is of a purely secular kind, and this is reflected in some of the narratives of participants in our research, such as this 58-year-old father who says that after a great deal of personal study, I have a better understanding of suicide and my son's struggles with depression and substance abuse. And he cites specific secular works that give him a sense of meaning regarding that experience. In some of our most recent findings, we have tried to fold in spiritual meaning-making alongside this kind of integration of the meaning of the experience. As we look at the impact for spiritually inclined Christian adults experiencing losses of a variety of kinds, natural and violent, finding what we have found in multiple studies, that positive religious coping has very little predictive impact in accounting for prolonged grief symptomatology. That surprised us. What we found, though, is that negative religious coping is predictive of prolonged or complicated grief, particularly as mediated by the powerful role of meaning-making. It is as if meaning-making represents a final common pathway for spiritual coping with strongly adverse events. With more time, I would say more about our longitudinal studies of spousal loss, drawing on the clock data set. Here I'll simply note that what we find is that an ability to make sense of the death of one's partner in later life predicts not only one's level of symptomatology in these other studies, but in this study, one's level of well-being, excitement, enthusiasm, purpose, pride, connection, hope, not merely in the immediate aftermath of the loss, but a full 4 years into the future. It is one of the most robust predictors of long-term adaptation. And so I see grieving as a process, as suggested in this image by Mary Hobson, of almost drawing into a kind of cocoon, a kind of constricted space in which we also begin to grow wings of new possibility. And as we study this process,
what has happened with those bonds of connection?
With more time than we had, we would hear this in the words of the bereaved themselves. We hear signals of this post-traumatic growth as it unfolds in the reports of our clients, those we serve in therapy. A growth that often takes said. I'd like to hit one final slide here, if I can. What we've found is that in looking at post-traumatic growth, that is, an enhancement of spirituality, a deepening of compassion, a burnishing of one's life purposes, the kind of work that Tedeschi and Calhoun have looked at so carefully. In our recent work published in the journal Traumatology, we found that the level of post-traumatic growth shows a curvilinear relationship with the intensity of prolonged grief symptoms. That is, when the distress is too little, there's little evidence of growth. Likewise, when the distress is overwhelming, growth is inhibited. And it seems to be maximized in the mid-range, where we have significant but not overwhelming tragedy to accommodate. As people do so, they attempt to integrate their stories of loss. And we might ask, along with this image by the Dutch artist Boy van Gogh, which is entitled Omdat ik hou van jou, because I love you, we might ask, how can we conserve stories of love as we fruitfully live above the text of these tragic tales? And one answer is given by Gail's experience, who in the aftermath of the trauma of her son's death formed a group called Team Max, animated by Twitter and Facebook calls to bring together communities to respond to significant local or global concerns in what she calls a form of strike force philanthropy. And in this, she may meet local needs, such as collaborating with Clean Memphis. They're working with my son Eric and a partner from Team Max to clean up benighted communities that greatly need them, as well as, in other contexts, together to feed the hungry, to provide shelter for the homeless. Or in this circumstance, I moved as I look at her face, this is Tess, this is Max's girlfriend, who stands as part of the many who have participated in Team Max events. In this instance, gathering together 4 tons of medical supplies in the city of Memphis to have lifted by FedEx to Haiti in the aftermath of the horrific tragedies associated with that earthquake 2 years ago. Getting that aid on the ground before the aid provided by the U.S. government. Extraordinary achievements by this community of concern. And so I want to give the final words of my presentation here to Max. Mentioned that as the car in which they were riding burned, Max was thrown from the vehicle. One thing that stayed in the car was Max's backpack. And 3 months after Max's death, it was returned to Gail by the highway patrol that had found it singed, burned around the edges. In that, they found Max's journal. And as Gail, with trembling hands, opened that journal, burned but still legible, she encountered some of Max's poetry. And the poem to which that journal fell open included these verses. Sometimes the cube won't fit into the circle-shaped hole. Sometimes life throws a rock at you, and you have to roll with it. It's okay to go through difficult things. Do so with courage, curiosity, and wonder. Isn't life wonderful? While the journey is at times difficult, literally anything is possible. The sun and the moon will do your bidding. Cast them out into the sea. Thank you for your attention. Enjoy your talk.
Speeches will be published in the proceedings, so wait for those. You have